Because this tutorial is already way longer than I expected it to be, we're just going to finish it off in one more video. And what we want to add, I want to add a little bit more user friendliness. I want to make it so you can see all of the available spots you can move. If it's black's turn, it'll have all the spots black can move. If it's white's turn, it'll have all the places white can move. And there's also a special case where sometimes in the game one player can't move. So in that case, we need to make it change back to the other player's turn. And if neither player can move, then it's just the game is over. So we're going to do all of those things really quickly, and I'm going to try really hard not to get too detailed, because I realize I tend to do that in some of the previous videos you might have noticed. All right, so first let's make it so it only changes to the next player's turn if that next player will be able to move. And if not, it'll just stay black's turn, or white's, whoever it already is. Okay, so we can do that right here where it changes the turn. We're just going to say if it's equal to 1, meaning it's black's turn, and white will be able to move, then we'll switch to white. So we'll say and can move, which is a function we haven't created yet, and we'll pass in the variable 2, then we'll switch to 2's turn. And we'll also say else if turn equals 2 and can move when we pass in the value 1 is true, then we'll switch to make it 1's turn. And then the last one is we say if neither of them can move, so we'll say if can move with the value 1 equals false, and can move with the value 2 equals false, then it's game over. So we'll just say, so let's just alert the user by saying game over. And we'll also set a variable to be true. So we'll say game over equals true, and create that variable at the top. Game over starts out equaling false, and then we're only going to let them click anywhere if game over is false. So if game over, we'll simply return. All right, so let's write this function called can move. And it's just going to take in an ID, which could be a 1 or a 2, meaning it's black's turn or white's turn. So this will tell us whether black is able to move or whether white is able to move. And really all we have to do is look at every single cell, every single spot in the grid, and see if it's a spot that we can place a tile. And if any of them say, yes, that's a valid spot you can move to, then this function returns true. So let's just iterate over every single spot on the grid. We can copy this. And we will pass in the row and the column into canClickSpot, which is a function we've already been using. So we'll just say if canClickSpot, passing in row and column, happens to be true, then return true. Otherwise, if it makes it through the entire grid without finding a spot we can click, then it means we can't move at all. So we return false. Okay, now there is one significant change we'll have to make now, because previously we had just been relying on the turn variable. And inside of the canClickSpot function, it used the turn variable to tell whether that person was able to move at that spot. So now we're going to be looking ahead to determine whether the next guy is going to be able to move. So we can't necessarily rely on our turn variable. So we're going to have to pass in another variable to canClickSpot. Let's pass in ID, and then canClickSpot has to receive another variable called ID. And it's going to in turn pass that to getAffectedDisks, because that's the one that actually uses the turn variable. So we pass that in here. And then getAffectedDisks also is called here, so now it has to pass in ID there, which ID doesn't exist. We do want to use the turn value in this case. We also have to pass in turn here, because that's a reference to the canClickSpot function. So canClickSpot function can only be used if we pass in all of the correct parameters. All right, so we passed in turn, we're good. Now the getAffectedDisks function has an ID value, and we need to use that everywhere where we used to say turn. So let's change all 16 references to turn so that they now say ID. All right, that should be all of them. Then we go back up here, and yeah, we already finished this. So this function should work now. And quick error, I just realized. I forgot to put the word if here. And now it works. Okay, we're good. All right, so we're just going to trust that this canMove function works, and we're going to figure out whether it works probably when we play this game enough. But for now, let's just assume it does. So the other thing we want to make this do is show the available spots you can place a disk. So let's create one more view element. Let's do something just like we did with the disks, where we have a disk layer on top of the background. Let's have a layer of the canMove areas. So let's just call it canMove layer. So let's say id equals canMove layer. And then create a quick reference to it at the top. Say var canMove layer inside the onload function. CanMove layer equals document.getElement by ID with the ID canMove layer. And then we just need to draw that anytime it changes whose turn it is. So including at the very beginning. Right after it draws disks, we'll say draw canMove layer. And they change their turn right here. So right after draw disks, we say draw canMove layer. So let's create that function, the one called draw canMove layer. In fact, let's make it right by the other one that draws the disks, which is right here. Let's just copy and paste it because it's going to be almost the exact same. We're just going to say draw canMove layer, and we say canMove layer will be reset back to nothing so that we can piece by piece place all of the parts that should actually be there on this layer. So we're going to go over every spot, every row, and for every row we're going to go over every column, so we have an individual cell we're looking at. We just want to call the function canMove, passing in the current player's ID, and anywhere that it says yes, you can move there, that's where we want to draw a little div element that's just an outline to show that that's a spot they can move there. So let's just move this code inside the spot where it's a 0, because it would only be able to do it in the case where it's a 0 anyway. So we'll say if value equals 0 and can click spot, passing in ID, which in this case ID equals turn, and then the current row and the current column. So if value equals 0 means it's a blank spot, and the can click spot passed in that value says yes, you can move there. We're going to create not a disk, we're going to make a disk outline. So I'm just going to name that disk outline. Copy and paste over all of these. We'll change it up a little bit in a second. And we also want to append it right here. And let's get rid of this else statement because we don't need it to do anything in that case. Okay, so what do we want it to actually look like? Well, we want it to be absolute positioning, just like it was. Let's keep it the same width and height for now. Let's keep it the same border radius. But we don't actually want a background color or a background image. Let's get rid of these. Oh, and we also need to make this say disk outline. And right here, we're just going to say disk outline dot style dot border equals, let's say 2px solid, and we can say the color black. And then in the case where it's a 2, we'll make it white. Let's test that. Oh, and I accidentally appended it to the wrong layer. I want to append it to the canMove layer. And we also need to tell it to be at a higher level so that it's on top of the other one. So let's say disk outline dot style dot z index equals 2. Save that, refresh. Oh, this is the problem. I'm checking what the value in the model is for this current spot, but I want to be checking whose turn it is to tell whether to make it a black outline or a white outline. So right here where it says value, this should actually say turn. Change that. All right, there we go. So we have the black outlines. Notice that they're not centered like these other ones that are solid, and that's because the outline extends outside of the actual size of the element. So we can change that. We can fix that by just making the width smaller. So let's say cell width minus 8. Let's try that. Looks good. So it looks like it's working. And these are the spots I'm allowed to click on, but you'll notice if I click on them, it doesn't actually work. If I click behind them, it does work. And that's because we need to add the onClick function to these outlines as well. And that's really easy. We already did that when we drew the green squares, so let's find that function, which is right here. We just need to say set attribute and have the onClick attribute point to a function of JavaScript. So we'll copy that. We'll paste that right here. Change it to say disk outline. And we're good. And now we have a fully functional Othello game that actually gives us hints about where we can move. And maybe you didn't actually want those hints. Feel free to remove that code.